So now I request Professor Margaret Walton-Roberts. There is already some questions from the GRFDT for you, which we hope you will take into account in your presentation. And these are the questions which have already come to me. Why is a focus on gender and migration relevant for the COVID-19 situation? And what resources can we draw on? And the other question, feminist agendas, what role do they play in recovery in the post-COVID period? So the request is that your presentation should include these issues. Over to you, Professor Margaret Walton-Roberts.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. And I'm very honored to be part of this activity. There have been a number of sort of very interesting webinars organized in light of the disruption of COVID-19. And I have been following the work of the GRFDT team. And so I commend you on a wonderful collection, and I'm very honored to be part of this group. And so thank you, Professor Ganesh, for that introduction. And yes, why is a focus on gender and migration relevant to understanding COVID-19? Well, I think you already outlined that very succinctly and very thoroughly for us. I mean, certainly the COVID-19 pandemic has brought to the surface the structural crisis in social reproduction and the increasing presence of migrant and racialized women, especially working in the health and care economy. Most of my comments will be kind of a North American orientation. I'm based in Canada. And so this is where I draw a lot of my current work from. I mean, certainly women's paid inclusion in the labor market has increased globally, but we know that men have not taken up much of the double burden of social reproductive tasks. And so what we've seen happen is that in many higher income nations, such as the USA and Canada, there's an increased reliance on often marginalized immigrants to provide child, elder, and other forms of low-paid care and domestic service. And so this process has been captured in the idea of global care chains, the work of Arlene Hochschild and Rochelle Paranis especially, but the idea that care labor is organized through global chains, and that these connections are across different locations, and they exploit intersectional divisions, including but not limited to gender, ethnicity, class, religion, and they're very much framed by an uneven spatial development. So this process has been intensified as governments have restructured welfare supports to the young, the old, and the infirm, and families have turned to these global care chains to fill in the gaps. And so this care labor, as Professor Ganesh indicated in her opening comments, has become essential to the functioning of the global economy. As she said, 3/4 of the service, these kinds of service sectors involve immigrant women, whether we're talking about internal migrants, especially in the case of India, but also international migrants. So it's essential to the functioning of the global economy. And yet it has been devalued and commoditized. And so OECD research has suggested that if this socially reproductive labor were fully accounted for in national calculations, it might increase GDP anywhere between 15 to 70%. So this is not an inconsequential sector of human activity that we are talking about. So my research has focused especially on healthcare workers, and this has become increasingly evident, the crisis here under this sort of COVID-19 pandemic. So 70% of healthcare workers are women. And while many conditions of work have improved, women remain less represented in leadership positions in health. And there is at least a 28% gendered pay gap across health occupations. And intersectional factors, as I mentioned, create greater vulnerability for both international and internal migrant and racialized women workers. So the importance of immigrant healthcare and allied care workers has become more and more apparent in light of the threat of COVID-19. On average, across OECD nations, 16% of nurses and just under 30% of doctors are foreign-born. And this has become evident when we've looked at the UK, the USA, Canada, parts of Europe, and especially when looking at the disproportionate number of deaths that have occurred in often relatively young healthcare workers. According to a recent report by MPI, for example, migrants make up 29% of physicians and 22% of nursing assistants in the USA. In the UK, 13% of NHS workers report a non-British nationality. And in Canada, 8.5% of nurses and about 26% of physicians were all internationally educated. So these frontline healthcare workers, such as nurses and doctors, have been prominent in the public's understanding of why we need to flatten the curve. But domestic workers, cleaners, personal support workers, and other care workers also carry a substantial burden in light of this crisis. Now, in terms of talking about gender, we should also mention that male migrant workers also made vulnerable to this crisis. And we've seen this in terms of construction workers in Singapore, who were made vulnerable to the crisis through overcrowding and lack of attention from public health officials. In the Gulf countries, we've certainly seen similar situations, but worryingly, we've also seen the demonization and the marginalization of these workers. And there's been inadequate recognition of the conditions of their employment and work actually intensify their exposure to the disease. And this is similar to migrant workers in meatpacking plants in North America, migrant workers in the agricultural sector, and of course, refugees and asylum seekers who have been made more vulnerable to these risks by the inadequate social protection and provisioning that's been made for them. So maybe I'll talk a little bit now about what kind of resources there are that can help us understand more about gender and COVID-19. And certainly gender disaggregated data is vital to understanding what's happening. We know this is relevant for men and women and for boys and girls, and that we've seen in work such as Caroline Corrado Perez's book, Invisible Women, Data Bias in a World Designed for Men, that we have an immense gender data gap, and this has a significant material impact on the lives of women and men. And again, some of those comments were earlier presented in the opening. I would just like to say there are a number of organizations that are helping to prioritize gender data awareness, collection, and utilization. And I thought for researchers and policymakers, many of whom may be on this webinar, it might be useful to share a few of those resources. I don't know if I can share my screen. Is that possible? Well, okay, let's see. Okay, I can't share my screen with you, so let me just read them off. So in terms of some of these useful resources, there is Women Count, which is the UN Women's Gender Data Program, which was created to improve how gender data is produced, used, and shared. That has inserted important analysis of what's happening in terms of COVID-19. DevX is a media platform for the global development community. They have partnered with Facebook to provide a gender data series, and they have 10 practical virtual events to create a better understanding of gender-related issues highlighted by the current pandemic. And they share important lessons on how to engage in gathering better data to inform the current crisis. Global Health 50/50, that's an independent evidence-based initiative to advance health and accountability for gender equality in global health. And a very interesting group, the ladysmithcollective.com, is a feminist research consultancy that helps internationalizations collect data. And they have developed a gender data kit to help governments and researchers, and they use WhatsApp. And they've already documented profound disruption caused by COVID lockdowns regarding migrant women's access to essential services in the Colombian and Venezuelan corridor. And so this really speaks to the earlier discussion about the rise of domestic violence that's been experienced under the lockdown. There's also the Gender COVID-19 Working Group based at SFU. It's a global group of researchers, health practitioners, and policy activists. They are sharing resources and expertise on topics related to gender equity, women's empowerment, human rights.
I am able to join this.
COVID-19. Okay, so they have produced a useful paper in the Lancet. And then finally, the Global Action on Men's Health is an interesting group. Their mission is to create a world where all men and boys have opportunities to achieve the best possible health and well-being. But their approach is based on the understanding of the needs of both sexes and promotes gender equality. So I can leave it there and speak about the second part of my issue in the next round, if that's possible. I didn't want to take too much time.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Professor Margaret Walton Roberts. You have given, even in the brief time given to you, you have given a sort of a sweeping view on how important care labor is in the global economy and specifically the North American economy, and how the healthcare sector is dominated by migrants and women at certain levels, and yet how their work, while so important, is devalued in many ways, including pay and the kind of respect that it gets. So I think that's a very important point that you have made, and thank you for listing out so many of the resources that are available. I request participants to please put your questions for Professor Margaret on your chat, naming her, saying that you would like to her to answer, and at the end of 2 other papers, we will get back to these questions.